Now, those of you who live in Netherlands and Subiaco know already only too well how unjust the DAP system is. Those of you who are worried about the Cottesloe seafront, the development plan all along Stirling Highway, the proposed Woolworths development adjacent to Captain Stirling Hotel, developers in Wembley and so on have good cause to be worried. Under the state government's new legislation, no street, no park and no public land is safe from development. The appallingly flawed Elizabeth Quay was an A-class reserve to be held in public hands in perpetuity. The government's taken it over to sell off to developers to build office blocks for the like of Sheffield. As I say, nowhere is safe. The Western Suburbs Alliance argues that these changes have been ideologically and commercially driven, and that the voices of the development industry lobby groups carry far greater weight than those of our councils and communities. Our letter to the Post also criticised the amalgamation process. Premier Barnett made it quite clear what outcomes he wanted before commissioning the now widely discredited Robson report. Amalgamation of local councils was the policy pursued by the Labour Party in Queensland, which contributed to the downfall and decimation of the Bligh government. Again, you may ask, why is our Liberal government importing failed Labour policies from the eastern states? Notice how quiet Premier Barnett and Minister Castrilli have gone on the amalgamation issue. No doubt they'll defer any announcements until after the state election, just like the cutting off of Riverside Drive won't be until after the election. Kevin Morgan, the Mayor of Cottesloe, will be talking about the Robson report and amalgamation issues, while John Hammond, the former Mayor of Cottesloe, will discuss the implications of the loss of control of the local government and community level. Then there's the government big picture advertising. Sorry, public information campaign. No overall plan for Perth, Grimsby circuses. The footy stadium here, the Riverside development there, a bit of light rail here, but at what cost? Ken Eastwood will be talking about this later. Western Suburbs Alliance has been accused of being against change. We are not against change, we are not against development, we're not against local reorganisation, local council reorganisation as such. What we are opposed to is forcing such measures through. We're opposed to the ruination of our suburbs and city by the erection of cheap, uninspiring, cookie-cutter buildings that are totally out of character with our lifestyle and aspirations. We want development. We'll be proud to pass on to our children and to our grandchildren, not designed to be knocked down in 20 years' time when they're no longer fashionable or profitable. And if we're to have any reorganisation of local governments, we want to see strong evidence of the benefits and cost benefits, and have a fair and open system for voting on the proposals, not the current inequitable referendum system. A well-known architect has said, we're good at putting up buildings, but bad at making places. In New South Wales and overseas, there's now a move to give local authorities and local communities a major say in what is called place shaping. What kinds of developments are best suited to their social and economic well-being? In such a system, local democracy is the winner. Our first speaker tonight was to be the distinguished historian Professor Thomas Standage, who sadly, as most of you will know, died a week ago. The title of his address was to be Seeking Wisdom, Truth, Beauty, and the Future of Community Democracy. Would that we could see more of these attributes around us today. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Colin has just mentioned my great friend Thomas Standage, and I have been given the family's permission to share with you a few lines of what Tom was intending to say tonight. His topic was seeking wisdom, truth, beauty and the future of community democracy. Tom began his speech by highlighting the numerous titles he had considered using. He then went on to say that, and I quote, "Something was missing. What I wanted in my title was silence, as well as noise, reflection, as well as action. I wanted in my title the very qualities absent from the state government's planning public rhetoric and from the shrill and shallow discourse of its agencies and consultants. Something different from the full public catastrophe of political power and bullying and the issue of factory reports and unsubstantiated directives. My theme, therefore, is that the desire to control others is a misuse, even an abuse, of freedom for self, and that a government can too readily restrict the powers of others and massively erode the civic freedoms won through pain and experience. These civic freedoms include community democracy and participation, local ideas of natural and people-made beauty, of social justice and harmony, of memory and history, and of cultural expression and engagement." End of quote. Tom was an extraordinary man who left his footprints all over this nation. He will be long remembered for his humility, intellect and passion for the rights of the individual and for their voices to be heard. I'll stand. And now I call to the microphone Mr. Ken Eastwood. Ken, would you please come to the microphone? In so doing, I'll read Ken's CV. Mr. Eastwood is a fellow and life member of CBA Australia, having held the positions of both WSA President and National President of CBA Australia. Having spent most of his professional life as an accountant in his own public practice, he has also owned and operated a group comprising 2 private acute surgical hospitals and 2 large private nursing homes. Before retiring in April 2000, Mr. Eastwood acted as Chief Executive Officer for 2 large law practices for 12 years. He was appointed a member of the General Division of the Order of Australia in 1994 in recognition of his contribution to the accounting profession and for services to the community. Mr. Eastwood's topic is profligate, who's paying for all these future projects. Welcome, Mr. Eastwood.
Thank you, Richard. Perhaps I should mention there are half a dozen seats up the front here if anybody would like them over the side. Tonight I'd like to ask you all to take a memory back to 3.5 years ago. At that time we had a very even result as to who would govern our state for the next term. So close was the result of that last election that the future government was decided by the minority National Party. At the time, we, the voting public, were mainly concerned about law and order, a very much under pressure public health system, the inadequacy of our public transport and major road systems, deteriorating education facilities, and the escalation of Perth's cost of living. So, having been a staunch Liberal supporter for all of my life, these comments are not about party politics, but they are about just how our present government has spent our taxpayer dollars. With a net state debt of $3.6 billion 3.5 years ago, we were easily convinced that the coming mining boom would solve all of our problems. Right now, after just 3.5 years of that mining boom, we have a state debt of approximately $17 billion. That's an increase of 460% in that short period. On current estimates, our net state debt will reach $24 billion by the 2014-15 financial year. Even with our projected population explosion, that's an increase from $2,100 per head of population to approximately $11,500 per head. Such an increase in net levels will have occurred during the most profitable 5 years in this state's history. But is there any good news? There is no evidence to suggest that our police force is in any better resourced, that our health system is in any better shape with more hospital beds and no more ambulance ramping, that our roads are coping with the increased traffic and that our public transport system is in better shape, that our education facilities are in better shape, that our cost of living pressures are easier to manage? No. Let's have a look at some of our government's more worrying decisions over the last 3 or 4 years. Why spend close to $1 billion by the time it's finished on Elizabeth Quay? This is a project which will yield no obvious social, cultural, environmental or commercial benefit to our city, and the diversion of Riverside Drive with its 9 to 10 sets of required traffic lights can only add to the traffic chaos which is obviously getting worse by the day. Surely there must be a public outcry at such wanton expenditure and destruction of our city's greatest asset. Well, yes, you're right. There has been a public outcry, but a petition of more than 14,000 signatures has been completely ignored by this government. This is expenditure which should have been utilised and better applied in many other areas requiring an injection of funds. Even 14,000 of us couldn't make anyone. In the current financial climate, why would we be spending a further 1.2 to 1.3 billion to build a new Perth stadium? Well, our government has the answer. We won't build it at all. We'll enter into an arrangement that will let a private developer design, build, finance and maintain the stadium, and our government will rent it back, presumably, over a 25-year period. Sounds good, but any private developer will have to recover the cost of the write-off of the asset they create, manage principal repayments and finance the project at interest rates much higher than any government would pay, plus yield an acceptable profit over the 25 years of the arrangement. In addition, the developer will be required to finance upgrades, refurbishment and maintenance and maintain a profit during the time the stadium lies idle, which in Perth is most of the summer months. Look forward to paying a bit more to go to the football. This method of financing a stadium is bound to cost us. It'll cost us 3 or 4 times the initial estimate to build such a facility, and is it really the way to finance our public infrastructure? Our state's AAA credit rating must be close to being sorely tested. The loss of that coveted rating will mean even more pain for the West Australian public. The loss of such a cushion against the cost of our other more essential borrowings will result in an increased rate of interest on all state borrowings. Expect a further leap in the cost of power, water, gas, healthcare and other essential services. Our public utility charges are increasing at such an alarming rate that all state government departments are now being directed to curtail their expenditure. Development assessment panels, with all their faults and shortcomings, are also costing us. In an excellently researched paper written by the President of the Local Government Planners Association in August 2012, Ian McRae commented in relation to DAP's procedures that people are now being paid to do things they previously did at no cost to the government. He states that the impact on the Department of Planning in its diversion away from strategic planning is incalculable. He further states that it is no coincidence that the department has recently had to go to the Treasury seeking further allocations due to the difficulty in delivering core departmental responsibilities. Indeed, $400,000 is now being spent working out whether the department is delivering taxpayers' value for money. As far as DAPs are concerned, it certainly isn't, Mr. McRae commented. One would have to assume that the cost effectiveness of DAPs would have been well and truly considered well before they're foisted on the community. The DAPs process has complicated and extended the approval process in very many cases. and now we're being told that we're not sure whether it works financially or not. It's costing us all an arm and a leg. You might think that we would grasp with both hands the experience of other states when it comes to the issue and costs associated with amalgamation of our local governments. Sadly, this is not so. Even though we read every day of the problems that amalgamations of councils on the east coast have caused, we push on regardless. Just 6 weeks ago, Queensland Press reported that close to 25% of amalgamated councils in that state are now scrambling to undo the damage and deamalgam. Only 20% of the community there is required to vote for such action to proceed, compared to a vote of 50% which is required here. With councillors being paid in excess of $120,000 each per annum to serve on these massive councils on the East Coast, and the huge costs associated with amalgamation and now de-amalgamation, one might ask, how do we pay for all this waste which yields no obvious benefits? Could it be you and I, the electors of Western Australia, who would have foot the bill? Thank you.
Before introducing the next speaker, I would like to acknowledge the presence of the Premier here tonight, Mr. Barnett. Ron Norris, where is Ron? Would you please join me up here, please? Mr. Norris is a qualified engineer and for the past 40 years has operated his own business as an insurance loss adjuster and risk management consultant. Together we shared the atmosphere of the Subiaco Council chambers when he was elected a councillor for the city of Subiaco in 1977. He served 2 terms, did not seek re-election and moved to Mosman Park in 1983. In 1987 he was elected a councillor in the town of Mosman Park until 2007 when he became the mayor. Ron has an interesting comment to make here, and I'll repeat it because I think it's worthwhile. Mr. Norris believes that one of the great weaknesses in local government is the lack of experience of elected members. There is an expectation that new councillors should be instantaneously familiar with town tax schemes, balance sheets, and all the services that councils provide to the community. He does acknowledge, however, that there are excellent training programs which bridge or attempt to bridge the knowledge gap. Mr. Norris is now speaking tonight on the DAP system and its implications. Would you welcome?
Thank you, Richard. Richard and I, 30 years ago, fought a similar campaign against a rapacious government over planning matters, so it's rather ironic we're here again, still fighting a similar but different battle. My topic tonight is the Development Assessment Panels, DAPs. It's an overview because I can assure you the town of Mosman Park hasn't yet, and most probably never will, have to wrestle with the DAPs application. The reason why I'm speaking in this manner as an overview is that I'm appalled at the manner in which those councils which have had to deal with the DAPs applications have been treated, the appalling manner in which elected members are treated, and the manner in which communities are treated in this process. It is an offence to common sense, the way in which it is being done, and it is something which should be resisted at every turn. I'd like to first, before going into my topic, just acknowledge the work done by the Western Suburbs Alliance group in forming themselves into this organisation and having the guts to convene a forum like this tonight for all of you to come together and to have an opportunity to hear from your elected members as to the manner in which this government has impacted on local government. But for the efforts of a group such as Western Suburbs Alliance, you would all be sole voices and largely lost. So what is the purpose of the Western Suburbs Alliance? In my view, it's simply a group of people who are offended by the manner in which our communities, indeed all of our communities, are being treated by this government. The arrogant disregard of local democracy and the erosion of the right of local communities to determine their own character cannot be ignored. It is likely that many of you don't know much about DAPS. I'm sure you've heard the term, and it's quite possible that your knowledge comes entirely from the media, and so the purpose of my paper tonight is simply to give you some understanding of how it impacts on us and you. Why did the government foist DAPS on us? I'm firmly of the view, and I'm certain in that view, that the sole purpose was to aid and abet the activities of developers, to and to strip from local government the opportunity to control the destiny of their own communities. I've heard the comment in relation to the government's commitment to developers and development from 3 separate ministers, and I'm very confident it actually does, no question, reflect the view of the whole of government. But I'm certain also that DAPS is an attempt to deal with councils such as Cottesloe and Cambridge, who literally have sought to fight to the brink to defend their communities. There's a perception from this government that somehow local government gets it wrong. The problem we have in this instance is that the state government has got it woefully wrong. DAPS have nothing to do with achieving better or quicker planning decisions. In fact, all of the evidence which has been gained since they were introduced points to the absolute reverse. The transparency, cost and time required to process planning applications are all worse now than they were before the introduction of DAPS. For evidence, I refer to the paper which Ken mentioned earlier from Ian McRae, President of the Local Government Planners Association. The paper was entitled DAPS 1 Year On, the Local Government Perspective. Mr McRae inquired of those local government planners who had had direct experience with DAPS the questions of whether they delivered increased transparency, consistency and reliability in planning decisions. And in all cases, the answers were resoundingly in the negative. Similarly, looking at the quality of the decisions which have been made, Mr McRae asked, did the DAP process add value to the decision? And would the decision have been any different without the DAP? An astounding 85% of the answers from the planners directly involved in this process was in the negative. Most significantly, and almost poignantly, Mr McRae finished his paper with the question, how could such a wasteful initiative, so counter to the interests of good planning, with an outcome so predictable, be allowed to happen? The answer is in the blind belief of the government that local government was responsible for the delays and the difficulties which the developers were experiencing with development decisions. This is despite the experience in New South Wales, where the incoming Liberal government removed the existing DAPs because they simply didn't work. Now we have the empirical evidence provided by Mr McRae, which demonstrates that the DAPs are a disaster. Turning now to the question of the impact of DAPs on councils, the next speaker will illustrate the division and uncertainty which DAPs have created amongst elected members. Councillors who offered themselves.
This is to do with transparency. So I'll take you to one of the office blocks. So 19 to 27 Catherine Street. Catherine Street, for those who don't know, is on our state heritage register. The terraces are amazing. They're kept in really good condition by all of the residents. The residents are really proud of their heritage on Catherine Street. And what what was put up for the public to see was this office block, which the public were invited to comment on. And then what was approved by the DAP was this. It's a similar version. It's not quite it. They ended up making some changes again, but this did not go out for public consultation. The first picture did, the second picture didn't. And this is roughly what happened with DAP transparency. The heritage architects rejected the development. The developer met in secret and privately with the DAP members. No public consultation on the new design. And the new design was put up for decision and approved. This is another example of DAP transparency, or lack of it. So those of you who travel along Railway Road, 125, 135, there's a little rundown shot there, and there are 4 residents, original homes. The 5 lots are owned by one developer. The site is reserved, public use hospital, and currently the buildings that are on it are non-conforming use as residential and small shop. On the 6th of December, the developer sent a development application to Subiaco Council. We refused it on grounds, and you can read in the minutes why we refused it. We notified the WA Planning Commission because it's not our area. We can't make any kind of rulings or approvals on a reserved site. So we notified the WA Planning Commission. We also have our own plans because we want to have more residential in Subiaco. We believe King Edward Hospital will be moved. We believe that site will be great for residential, and so we want this site to be part of our residential infill, along with the hospital at some point in time in the future. So we elected to resolve to zone the site residential R80. We sent, in the meantime, the developer has an RAR produced by the Department of Planning. It recommends approval. It ignores our zoning that we resolved in December, and it ignores our reasons for refusal. But however, the DAP is transparent at this point. At this point in time, the DAP refused the development application because of the reserve. And the minutes were published, and from my point of view, everything was transparent up to that point. Then, in 2012, something happened. I don't know what happened, but in 2011, I could see that the DAP was transparent. In 2012, it changed. So, the developer goes and appeals the refusal of that. There was a secret meeting on the 21st of March, and I have to say that SAT meetings are normally held behind closed doors. But the problem I had with that meeting was that Subiaco Council was not invited to attend the meeting. Why wasn't it? Now, we normally attend SAT meetings. We normally go in to negotiate on things, but we weren't invited, at least not to my knowledge, and I've been unable to qualify whether we had an invitation or not. And it's a question for me. On the 19th of April, the WA Planning Commission advertised a scheme amendment to change it from reserve to urban so that it then come under our control. And then our zoning as residential R80. On the 7th of May, the SAT proceedings completed. No idea what happened there. And then sometime in August, an undated determination was released to approve the development application, which is what you see on the screen there. There's no residential in that whatsoever. No residential. No. And so the Post, I want to thank the Post publicly because the journalism that the Post has been. They went out of their way to find material, and they knew that I was interested in this, in the secrecy, so they kept me informed of all the information that they were finding out about the process. So I have some unanswered questions, and most of these questions have gone to the Minister Day, and the answers, I haven't had the answers to these questions. But I want to know whether there was a forum on the 21st of March to form a DAP, because you can't have a DAP panel with it, you know, DAP doesn't exist unless it comes together as a forum. Why didn't Subiaco participate in SAP proceedings? You know, what was the basis used to consider approving a development application on reserved land? And it's still reserved land. It still is.
Illegal approval.
Well, that's the conclusion that people are coming to. Exactly. What weight was given to the City of Subiaco's proposed scheme amendment, residential R80, in their deliberations? Did they consider that we had resolved to rezone that area residential? What date was the DA approved? That the determination came out undated. There was no mention of any names present at any meetings. And, you know, why wasn't the City of Subiaco notified of the approval? At least I wasn't notified. As an elected member, I was not notified. And why did the Director of Planning, of the Department of Planning, write to the City of Subiaco claiming its decision to zone the area residential R80? It claimed our decision was not orderly and proper planning. These are the unanswered questions for me. And when I saw that article in the Post on the 16th of June, I was desperate. What can I do? What can I do to change this lack of transparency? So I called my very first elected members motion. My very first elected members motion, in a matter of months of being on council, I wanted our councillors to resign from the DAP. I wanted our council to ask the Minister to resolve the DAP, but unfortunately the motion lapsed for one of the mover and seconder. And I don't blame anybody because of that. It's my lack of experience with these matters. I've only just taken an interest in the DAP in this short amount of time, and if I had Ian McRae's paper, I think I could have at least got the motion up for debate. You know, that would have been great. It may not have got through, but at least there would have been debate on the floor, and people could have heard, you know, how elected members feel about this. If we have time, I'd like to talk about what's in the reports, but there is some case law with us now that says that a town planning scheme cannot be ignored on the basis of Directions 2031 or any other strategic document. And if we have time at the end, I will discuss that further. And I leave you with a picture of how...
now to introduce to you Mr. Max Hipkins. Max, Mr. Hipkins is a qualified planner, engineer and architect with practical experience in Australia and overseas. Most of his professional life he has worked as a development consultant in the private sector. In local government, he has held positions of Director of Planning at the cities of Edmonds and Perth. At Perth, he worked on a master plan for the city, which included the waterfront. Reviews were heard next. He is currently a Fellow of the Planning Institute of Australia and Mayor of the City of Subiaco. No, I'm sorry. There's only one council really, isn't there? Max's speech is titled The Erosion of Local Government's Planning Powers. Would you welcome Mr. Max?
Thanks, Richard. Local government in Western Australia began with the creation of the city of Perth in 1856. It made sense to allow local decision-making in an area the size of Western Australia. And following statehood in 1890, local communities continued to control their own affairs with assistance from the state. The passing of the Town Planning and Development Act in 1928 formally introduced planning control and permitted local governments to prepare planning schemes with the general object of improving and developing their land to the best possible advantage. This gave very wide powers to local government to decide the character of local communities. Things changed in the late 1950s when post-World War II industrial development pressures at Kwinana prompted the need for regional planning. The coming into operation of the Metropolitan Region Planning Scheme in 1963 saw the beginning of the erosion of local government's planning powers. I accept that regional planning of major infrastructure and land uses was necessary and has been beneficial, but the provisions of the regional planning scheme prevailed over any inconsistent provisions of a local planning scheme. The state supervisory body, initially the Metropolitan Regional Planning Authority, now the WA Planning Commission, allowed local governments to administer the regional scheme under delegated authority. In the mid-1970s, the Town Planning and Development Act was amended to introduce the concept of statements of planning policy. That is, state government policies which had to be taken into account when local governments prepared or amended town planning schemes, a further constraint on local planning powers. 1991 brought the introduction of redevelopment authorities at East Perth, Subiaco and elsewhere, in whose areas of operation all planning schemes were revoked. These bodies were required to consult with affected local governments, but in practice they did whatever they liked. Various local redevelopment authorities morphed into the Metropolitan Redevelopment Authority, which commenced operation at the start of this year. This body is responsible for the Perth waterfront project, occupying the site of our heritage-listed and first proclaimed parkland on the Perth Esplanade. This project, in my view, is a complete disaster for a whole host of reasons. But I don't want to go into that now. In the mid-1990s, by an amendment to the Town Planning and Development Act and regulations, local governments lost their control over the content of town planning schemes and amendments once they passed a resolution to prepare the scheme or amendment. Up until this time, local governments could discontinue the scheme or amendment at any time they wished, and often did so as the result of public objections to proposals. It was a significant change by the Planning Minister at the time without consultation with local governments or the community. Under this legislative change, the Minister can not only instruct local governments to finalise the scheme or amendment, but also how to finalise it. In 1999, the town planning regulations were amended to introduce the model scheme text. This is a template for the preparation of local planning schemes and amendments that local governments must follow. By this simple move, local governments lost the opportunity to design planning schemes to suit the special requirements of their individual districts. For example, the model scheme text contains no provision for the retention of significant trees. With no guidelines for their protection, is it any wonder that so many mature trees are being lost? In 2002, performance criteria were introduced into the residential design codes by way of a mandatory state planning policy. This effectively removed development standards for practically every decision in residential development, so that the body responsible for determining applications for planning approval will not be bound by standards attuned to community expectations. Disagreements over satisfaction of performance criteria can end up being reviewed by the State Administrative Tribunal, which seeks to find a compromise, often at odds with the local community. A few years ago, I don't know exactly the date because no notice was given, the district planning committees of the WA Planning Commission were quietly done away with. These committees comprise representatives from local governments. They discussed regional issues and fed recommendations directly into the WA Planning Commission. Obviously, the Planning Commission considered that it no longer needed to hear officially from local government and disbanded these committees without formally advising local councils. At least one council still appoints members to the District Planning Committee for the Western Suburbs, waiting for a meeting to be called. Although there hasn't been one for over 2 years. The most significant attack on local government's planning powers, causing the most angst today, was the introduction of Development Assessment Panels, or DAPs, via an amendment to the Planning and Development Act of 2010 and new regulations in 2011. The legislative change required applications above the specified value to be determined by a 5-member panel, 3 of whom are appointed by the Minister and 2 by the relevant local government. The proposal was based on a system operating in New South Wales, since abandoned, where DAPs considered applications with a value in excess of 50 million. In WA, other than in the city of Perth, mandatory DAP applications were defined with a value above only 7 million and 7 million or more, and optional DAP applications are between 3 and 7 million. That's a long way from the 50 million in New South Wales. Well-respected local government legal practitioner Dennis McLeod, in a conference paper prepared before the introduction of DAPs, stated the change involved a radical philosophical change in assessment of development applications in WA. From a system emphasising decisions by elected councillors responsible to their local community, to a system emphasising decisions by a majority of technical specialists who are appointed by the state government and are not responsible to the local community. The justification for this radical change does not stand up to scrutiny, as the often quoted Ian McRae's paper clearly demonstrated at a recent forum. After extensive research, Ian concluded, and I quote, DAPs have failed to deliver against the avowed criteria of success, that is, transparency, consistency and reliability. They fail on cost, having overshot the budget. They fail on efficiency, having introduced new areas of inefficiency and double handling. On balance, they fail on the speed of decision making, and there is no evidence of them having improved the quality of decisions made. Indeed, more applicants over the past year than in the previous 6 years have been unhappy enough to challenge at the SAT. For many people, DAPs have been the last straw. There is a limit to how much the state government can suppress local communities for no good reason. If the DAP projects were matters of state importance, there could be some justification. But almost without exception, none of these projects within the metropolitan area have been in that category. The whole purpose of introducing DAPs appears to be to take decision-making of development applications away from local government, leaving it to decide only simple applications like houses and back sheds. In relation to planning responsibilities, local government has been stripped of its independence and has become merely an instrument for the implementation of state government policy. I regard this as a most unhealthy situation, one that I will do my very best to reverse. The time has come for people to stand up and be counted, to demonstrate that what the government is doing today is totally unacceptable. This is why I have today nominated for the seat of Netherlands in the full.
The next speaker, Mr. Kevin Morgan. This was a most interesting, if I may say so, CV. Mr. Morgan is clearly a modest man. Either that we wanted to keep the things moving quickly. It may appear that I'm being this courteous, but having been given only one line of copy for Mr. Morgan's introduction, I can assure you that that is not the case. Mr. Morgan is a commercial litigation lawyer who for 7 years has been the Mayor of Cottesloe. Mr. Morgan, subject tonight is the Robson Report and Council amalgamation.
Thank you, Richard. The Robson Report. The Robson Report is part of Colin Barnett's so-called reform agenda to forcibly abolish metropolitan local councils. The report is as to what should replace them. Prior to the election, Mr. Barnett may decide to downplay his promise to force these council changes, in which case he'll delay the report's release until after the election. Although the report has not yet been released, I can say that the report won't be worth the wait. We know from the draft that it contains little scientific reasoning or empirical support. What it will do is map our worst case scenario for the Western Suburbs, in which our civic centres may move to Stirling, Leederville or Fremantle. For Mr. Barnett, most of Robson's work was done when Robson agreed to report on how to change things without first answering whether there's a need for change, thereby ensuring that this threshold question is bypassed, no longer asked in public debate. The public debate now assumes that there must be a need to abolish some councils. This gets Mr. Barnett halfway to where he wants to go, which is to go ahead and abolish councils. As I'll explain later, he doesn't really care what replaces them. If the public already accept we must abolish councils, he may risk they won't be too upset if they only find out after the election what the replacement councils look like. The eventual release of the report, whenever that does occur, will fulfil Robson's other political role, which is to recommend a radically harsh outcome, such as 300,000 plus councils, allowing Mr Barnett to play the good guy by opting instead for a merciful compromise, such as Welder's alternative halfway model of 100,000 population councils. But there's always party politics. Even the Welder model is somewhat party political, because under it, some already party politicised councils get to survive and swallow their non-politicised neighbours like the Western Suburbs. And by the way, the Western Suburbs don't survive under any model. New councils, the replacements, they'll be easy prey to party supported candidates, no matter which merger model is picked, because the parties themselves will be the most adept at reorganising to contest elections across reorganised boundaries, even if only at G4. The real task at the party political level will be to gerrymander the new councils and their boundaries, so that the spoils are equally shared between the parties, so as to get the bipartisan support this agenda will need. Political parties do benefit from having compliant local councils, because party politicised councils will be subject to centralised command strictures of party politics, whereby party discipline can be used to stifle opposition in councils. Nowadays, few voices of opposition are heard, in part because our major parties chase the same corporate sector for election donations. He who pays the piper calls the tune. So it's only to be expected that party politics is often a contest between variations on the same tune. They're all focused on the economic and, to a lesser extent, environmental impacts, and have little incentive to look closely at the social impacts on communities or at the health and well-being of their residents. Don't get me wrong, I am pro-business. It's the economy, stupid. But I do recognise that good public policy comes from healthy public debate, contests of ideas, thesis and antithesis, until the correct solution is obvious to all sides of the debate. Their independence from party strictures has allowed Western Suburbs councils to remain independent voices of their communities. They largely remain undistorted by vested interests that, for good or for bad, the political parties do represent. If Mr Barnett is re-elected, he will silence our community voices, and this silence will endure for a generation, simply because it will disengage the broader community from any sense of real ownership of his new councils. Communities will be stripped of their long pedigree councils and of each council's web of community networks, to instead become a plaything of party politics, where party interests dominate, not community interests. Another way. There is another way. Instead of being silenced, our local councils must be empowered to coalesce into regional subsidiary councils. The regional council can represent them on a Greater Perth authority, owned and controlled by all councils. On behalf of those councils, it will deliver metro-wide services for a few key needs, such as waste disposal and metropolitan-wide planning for transport and land use. Even the draft Robson report acknowledges that a Greater Perth authority can deliver nearly as much economic efficiency as Robson's biggest merger option. The Greater Perth model not only delivers the same efficiencies touted by Mr Barnett under his Robson plan, it also gives our communities the added benefit of not having their councils abolished in order to achieve these efficiencies. A council-owned and controlled Greater Perth authority will amplify the voice of each community, and by acting for all of them, it can talk on equal terms whenever it meets on their behalf with the state government all say the WA Planning Commission. Plunder. The reason why Mr Barnett will ignore these community alternatives is because the alternatives do not abolish councils, which would defeat his party political objectives to reduce council numbers so as to strip them of assets and to party politicise them. How do I know this? Because Mr Barnett has past form in using council changes to bring about party political objectives, and past form in his changes leading to a financial windfall to the state. Some 30 years ago, the franchise in local government was widened to include residents who didn't own land. This wasn't good for Liberals, particularly in the city of Perth, with 3 councillors from CBD wards outvoted 24-3 by suburban ward councillors. Most rates came from the CBD, but were spent mainly in the suburbs. When they couldn't get it fixed by the state, they found a saviour in Mr Barnett. An FOI request should reveal he was then an executive of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the first proponent to document to the old city of Perth a plan to break it up into smaller councils, with the new city of Perth to be confined to the CBD. Mr Barnett mapped his proposed new boundaries, which to a large extent accurately predicted the boundaries eventually adopted for Vincent, Cambridge and Victoria Park, when his proposal came to fruition years later. His breakup of the old city of Perth yielded massive windfall profits to the state government that did later enact his plan. Like a one-trick pony, Mr Barnett now plans to do the same thing. This will be a grand scale. It's going to be across the whole metropolitan area. The chance to bill for community assets will dwarf what was taken from the old city of Perth. That he walks both sides of this street, arguing then for small councils, arguing now for bigger councils, shows how devoid of principle his local government agenda is. This gross dereliction of duty to the communities he represents is sadly no orphan, with a similar dereliction occurring with his development assessment panels, which allow property developers, in my view, to in effect self-regulate. Create a recipe for public corruption to dwarf WA Inc. This despite their abandonment elsewhere. We must use democracy against bullying. Mr Barnett's modus operandi will be to try to bully through his abolition of Western Suburbs councils by offering not to beat them up so badly if they instead go quietly. We've already seen an example with his offer that says we can voluntarily agree to a G4 merger or end up as part of a much bigger Robson merger. To deal with a bully like Mr Barnett, we need to stare him down at the ballot box. Otherwise, there will be a conga line of others to follow and no voices of opposition left. For this reason, I intend to nominate as an independent candidate for the state seat of Cottesloe for the March 2013 election. I see myself as a community independent, a voice to focus the public policy debate on the social impacts on communities and and on the health and well-being of residents, whose interests will be my touchstone in weighing the merits of policy proposals. I am not captive to party politics. I will put community first. I will strive for local voting to decide whether there should be any changes to your local council, and for there to be a return to local control over local planning. There are also health fears. What motivated me to stand was the realisation that Mr Barnett's dereliction of duty with councils and planning was just the tip of the iceberg. These two disastrous moves are simply canaries in the coal mine, alerting us to a potentially much bigger disaster in the area of food safety. I have discovered that without independent testing as to the safety of doing so, Mr Barnett lifted an earlier ban on genetically modified crops being grown in WA. He instead relies upon a system of self-regulation for food safety, even though he knows it provides no independent testing, and even though he knows it will allow GM crops to start growing in WA. He can and should be aware this will inevitably infest our whole wheat belt and the food bowl from which Perth eats. And this can't be undone, even if independent testing later proves it to be unsafe, heaven forbid, making our food bowl akin to a nuclear wasteland, and by then, no doubt causing great harm potentially to our own health on a scale greater than even what asbestos used to cause. His retort is to point to previous GM imports, but growing GM in WA is far riskier than merely importing it. The harm from imports can be stopped simply by stopping imports, but you can't get rid of GM once it's already in our pastures. My candidacy, I intend to offer myself as a candidate to stop these civic planning and health disasters, to avert them by replacing Mr Barnett as our local member. Whether or not my campaign is successful will depend upon whether ordinary people motivate themselves to do something to support the campaign, make a difference. Yes. Our strength will grow if individuals make it their business to convince every local they know or that they live near to vote for me, no matter who they usually support. Bad things happen if good people stand by and do nothing when the occasion arises. The state of WA and its Liberal Party can survive if Mr Barnett is not re-elected in the state seat of Cottesloe, but our Western Suburbs communities cannot survive in the long term if Mr Barnett is re-elected in Cottesloe. I offer the communities of Claremont, Cottesloe, Mosman Park, Mount Claremont, North Fremantle, Evelyn Grove and Swanbourne an opportunity to draw a line in the sand against party politics, which delivers nothing to our communities, because the Liberals give us nothing because they know they can't lose the seat, and Labor gives us nothing because they know they can't win it. An opportunity to win the seats for themselves. Those of you who can, vote Kevin Morgan, your community independent candidate for the state seat.
Well, good night.
Gutless.
Intently on the way out.
I have been handed a note from the Premier, who has tendered his apologies. I have to leave to present the State Science Awards. And he says here, MB, the Robson report will be released in the next few weeks. And he signed it. these parts, and has extensive experience in local government and his daily pursuits as a lawyer over the past 27 years. Mr. Hammond was first elected as a councillor for the town of Perthhdale in 1986 for a 3-year term, and 7 years later, in 1996, won a seat back on the council. A year later, he became the mayor for a period lasting 6 years. He has been president of Perthhdproductions since 2003. His daily endeavours as a lawyer have resulted in him acting in many local government inquiries, including the cities of Belmont, Joondalup, South Perth and Coburg. Mr. Hammond's topic is implications of loss of control at the local government community level.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My topic is the loss of control by local government and communities throughout Western Australia. And I'm going to highlight Cottesloe. I think at this stage of the evening, given I've been given the graveyard shift, some of you may recall the Joni Mitchell song, Big Yellow Taxi, and I won't sing it to you, but I'll quote a few lines from it. They paved paradise and put up a parking lot with a pink hotel, a boutique and a swinging hotspot. Don't it always seem to go if you don't know what you've got till it's gone? And one of the things that really concerns me about the developments we're seeing in the Western Suburbs, one of the things that really concerns me about what we're seeing in the Western Suburbs, particularly the Woolworths proposal on the Captain Stirling site, the increased height limits along the beachfront, is this incredible homogenisation of our society. The reason we are here is because we want to protect the beautiful diversity that we have in Cottesloe, that we have in Melbourne. These are the suburbs that are the jewels of Western Australia because they contain our heritage. We can take our children back to the houses that we may have lived in Louise Street or Eric Street in Cottesloe. They're beautiful places, not to be destroyed by another Woolworths, another McDonald's. It's the last thing we need on Stirling Highway. Over the years, Cottesloe has been fighting tooth and nail to keep heights down on the beachfront. And we may or may not have lost that battle. But over the years, there's been a petition of over 13,000 people. There's been inquiries by design. There's been local government elections, and essentially a war of attrition to wear us down to try and change our mind that maybe increased heights on the beachfront are a good idea. We've consistently said they're not. So what did the government do? After hearing this for 2 decades, it imposed its own solution. It told us, Cottesloe, that we had to enact a plan which allowed for 8 stories, up to 8 stories on the Ocean Beach Hotel site, and 6 stories on the Lido site and 5 stories in between. Nobody wanted it, but the state government gave it to us anyway. Now the council is being forced to go to the Supreme Court to try and ameliorate the effects of this increased height. So what are the implications of all of that? Local government will become a tokenistic body and it will not be worthwhile serving on it because the state government is making it very clear that it has the power to do what it deems fit. And I think if it comes to the crunch, we need to see local councils actually resign in protest because they will not be fulfilling a role for which they're elected if they're merely to become a conduit for what the state government wants. So I'm going to keep it very, very short. Everyone knows the Cottesloe debate, but it's been imposed on us, foisted on us, and it's not good enough, and I'm sorry the Premier had to leave, so we'll have to told it one final time. Another case in point is the Woolworths site on Stirling Highway. Credit must go to the local member there, Bill Marmion, but I'd much rather have Max Hipkins as my member. Even the local member there is running scared with letters to his residents saying it seems that nobody supports this idea. What are we going to do? Unfortunately, he's not coming out like Mr. Hipkins and saying it won't happen. So I think it's fantastic that Mayor Morgan and Mayor Hipkins are standing. It's finally going to give the Western Suburbs someone else to vote for and a means of protest to say this really isn't good enough. society. And this song was sung in the 1960s by a protest singer called Pete Seeger. I think you're all going to know what it is. And this is what's going to happen to us in Western Australia if we don't keep fighting buildings such as the Perth Convention Centre and the like. Hideous, destructive to our environment. We don't know what we've got until it's gone. That Perth Convention Centre is a classic example of the shocking architecture in Western Australia.
Little boxes made of ticky-tacky, little boxes, little boxes, little boxes.
So I urge you to reject little boxes all through the Western Suburbs. Office now.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the speakers list. And that now gives you an opportunity we're going to have a panel come up on the stage, and you'll have your opportunity to ask questions and hopefully get the answers that you're looking for. Would the panel please like to take a seat on the Mayor Henderson and William Stokes? Whilst this is happening, I should give the courtesy of introducing Mrs. Heather Henderson and also Mr. Wayne Stubbs. And I'll read Mrs. Henderson's CV first. Mrs. Henderson was first elected to the Subiaco Council in May 1990 and completed a 13-year term in 2002. 3 years later, in May 2005, Mrs. Henderson was elected Mayor of the City of Subiaco. Mrs. Henderson is a State Councillor of the Western Australian Local Government Association and the Vice Chair of the Women's Australian Local Government Association. Her civic associations are many, and she is currently patron of the Subiaco RSL sub-branch, the Subiaco Schoolboy Rifle Club, Pelican Board Sea Scouts, and Vice Patron of the Subiaco Football Club, Go Lions, and Active Foundation. Mrs. Henderson recently retired from a school teaching position, having spent most of her career working with children with disabilities. Mr. Wayne Muntz, who has also joined the panel. Mr. Muntz' working life commenced in the exploration of mining industry and geology. He subsequently took up his interest in finance and commerce, completing a Bachelor of Business degree and still later undertaking a graduate diploma in Human Resource Management. He is a fellow CPA and spent 20 years with Western Mining Corporation Resources in the Eastern Goldfields, Adelaide and Melbourne. In recent years, he has devoted considerable energy to environmental and conservation activities in the Western region of Perth. He is currently the Chairman of the Western Region Environmental Network. Ladies and gentlemen, you now have the opportunity to be heard. Are there any questions from the audience?
I have one here. My name is Elaine Jacoby and I'm a ratepayer in the City of Netherlands. First of all, I'd like to thank the speakers tonight for giving up their valuable time and addressing the Western Suburbs Forum. I'd like to address this question to Mr. John Hammond, given his legal credentials and expertise. It's a common knowledge that for $25,000 donation, you can receive a private audience with the Premier. Unfortunately, he's not here tonight, so we don't have to pay that much. In the 1980s, government became very involved with developers, resulting in the infamous WA Inc. Can you see any similar pattern or parallel emerging in the performance of this government? Mr. Hammond.
Who wants to answer that question?
I think that those type of dinners are always dangerous, because if you're paying such a huge sum of money to be in the presence of a Member of Parliament or the Premier, then there's obviously an expectation that there'll be a payback. So I do see a problem with it, yes.
Thank you.
Well, if I could. A few weeks ago in the Western Australian Business News, one of the journalists, Paul Plowman, wrote a full-page article titled "Lines Blurred Between Big Business and the State," and he was actually asking, are we seeing a new style of WA Inc? So I think the danger signs are there. Chevron was specifically mentioned in this article, and Chevron has been cultivated as one of the developers at the Perth foreshore.
Look, I think the question that you raised is very pertinent to DAPs. If you look at DAPs, they are awfully streamlined for electoral donations. They essentially enable the Minister to appoint the majority decision makers on any planning application of significance in this state. You know, the 3 members of DAP that he appoints, no doubt they're on a short time frame which will expire unless they have the continued patronage of the Minister. You can see that political parties will in future be able to go along to developers and say, you know, we actually control this system now. It's no longer decentralised. So I can see that, as New South Wales found, that these DAPs start to breed a lot of corruption problems. The members of DAP, you wouldn't know them. The people in the industry know them. But unlike councillors, most people wouldn't know who they are. And there's no appeal from their decision. So it provides this fantastic opportunity where developers have every reason to try to, by hook or by crook, get a DAP decision in their favour, because no one can appeal from that decision. And so it puts all this likelihood that there may well be corruption in the future, because there's just no safeguards to stop it.
Oligarchy has arrived.
My name's Cameron Pesty. My name is Cameron Posey. I'm the Greens candidate for North Metro at the next state election. 2 quick observations. One is that not all political parties are doing bidding with developers. Ours is not. The other is that we have here, I think, the interesting basis for an alternate DAP. We could have we've got a good selection of good community members here that could be making decisions rather than the existing DAP structure. But more seriously, the question I was going to ask, building on Councillor Matheson's examples of where these the lack of transparency, lack of accountability is generating not what Directions 2031 was supposed to generate. It's actually generating office space rather than residential space. I wanted to ask some of the other members here whether they have specific examples there where DAPs aren't just unaccountable and to the local government, but are actually generating bizarre results that have no meaningful connection with the state planning.
I can answer that with respect to wards in Stirling Highway. You've got vacant space at Claremont, vacant commercial space at Subiaco. Why do you need more commercial space on Stirling Highway? It just doesn't make sense to me. 2031 was about increased residential densities. It wasn't about spreading out commercial activity, unless you're talking about providing jobs up in Joondalup or down in Rockingham or Mandurah, and that's what's needed to balance the transport system. To keep on loading more and more into central Perth, where the roads can't take much more, the public transport can't take much more. There's no logic to all these major projects on the waterfront and the City Link and down at the Causeway. It's just over-concentration when we need the jobs in the suburbs.
Say a few words about DAP, given that one of my councillors presented tonight having a passion for DAPs. Subiaco has had the most DAP applications, 12, 6 of them mandatory, and 4 that have been chosen to be dealt with in the 3 million to 7 million. What we found is that DAP has been one of the most divisive elements within our community. Our elected members are disenfranchised with their elected members. Our residents are up in arms about the decision that's been made. Our DAP representatives from the city of Subiaco are almost alienated, which is really unfortunate in that position. I think that we need to review DAPs, and I know that they've just had a look at it. My view is they could change DAP overnight. 3 elected members, 1 chairing, and 2 persons as experts.
Thank you, Bruce Haynes, Claremont. Information and an invitation. I'm sorry the Premier isn't here to hear the information. I'm hoping someone can convey it to him. I was present at the evaluation conducted by the Department of Planning into the first year of operation of DAPS. Regrettably, about half a dozen metropolitan councillors attended. Their criticism, therefore, was overlooked by the Department of Planning because about 30 of the appointed officers were there saying that there were only marginal adjustments. Therefore, the advice received from the officials to the Minister is that DAPS are by and large fairly good. The Emperor's clothes need marginal adjusting only. It is the fault of your representatives not turning up at the time to say the things that we have heard tonight, which means that information hasn't got through officially to the Minister. Somehow we have to make that known to the Minister. The other information is an invitation that the Football Club Claremont, regrettably ex-mayor, the Land Corps will be holding a public forum to discuss the redevelopment of the Claremont Oval up to 8 stories. So if you're not familiar with that, that is a public meeting with the Land Corps for that information. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Wayne Monks. I live in Wembley Downs. I'm standing as independent candidate for Chestons. I'm very much in favour of empowering the community and giving back their local rights which have been taken away and eroded so drastically. I'd like to respond, Bruce. I'm a passionate member of the Claremont Footy Club. My father played games, league games with Claremont. There were 4 generations at the grand final 2 weeks ago. Hope you're an instrumental supporters there. But in terms of the Claremont Footy Club, I've seen the post with the public submission period, the open day, and I've also privy at the Claremont Footy Club breakfast several weeks ago before the grand final that of the scale of the development by the architect who did the presentation. And Dennis Marshall was also involved on behalf of the Claremont Footy Club to the great Claremont Stout to also assist with our presentation. I am really concerned about the changes to the scale of development around the Claremont Footy Club. 8 stories encroaching very close to the boundary is absolutely ridiculous and scandalous, and I'll be putting in a submission and hopefully getting to the open day. So people need to respond. It's a traditional home of footy in Claremont in the Western Suburbs, and it goes right up to the zone in North Beach. So people need to put in a submission against the high-scale development encroaching on the boundaries, virtually the boundaries of the ground. And it's going to change the traditional aspect of the ground in terms of other supporters. It's got seating for 1,200, you get over 2,000 people some of the top games. So I'd just like to follow that up with a positive comment. Thank you.
The previous questioner mentioned that the Commission hadn't heard some of the unrest in the community. Let's hope the Premier gives him the message from tonight's meeting.
Who's got the microphone?
Hello, my name is Bruce Smith, and I'm a town planner. I'd like to thank Max for his history of town planning, but the thing that I think is important for people to understand is that the theme of planning since 1928 to now is the move from amenity preservation. That was the historic purpose of town planning, to preserve your amenity. Now, I went and listened to Eric Lumsden give a 2-hour talk on planning a couple of years ago, and he didn't mention amenity preservation once. He only talked about development facilitation. And the whole town planning system has been rorted so that it's become development facilitation. Amenity preservation has been forgotten. That was a statement. Kevin, have you heard anything about the rumour that the WA Planning Commission
has drawn a line around the Coslow Golf Club and is going to allocate the jurisdiction of that area to the MRA, sometimes known as the Metropolitan Redevelopment Authority, but in reality, madness running amok. Have you heard anything, the rumour of that? Because I understand that the MRA wants to create a vibrant, exciting marina and provide for people to live in Coslow around what was the underutilised golf club. And I think we could name it the Prince Charles Marina.
Look, it would surprise me that they've got their eyes on a golf course, it's Seaview Golf Course. What I can say is that it would certainly go a long way, well, not a long way, but it would start to take a small bite out of that $20 billion debt if they could offload that, which, so I'm sure they've got their eye on it. The Premier did scoff at the suggestion of making a contribution to upgrading the regional foreshore reserves down there initially. Later, when he started to cop a bit of flack over it, well, possibly the election coming on, he started to make noises that he may well make a contribution now, but he did that on the proviso that they could find some land to sell. At the time, maybe I started the rumour because I did suggest that I couldn't rule out Seaview Golf Course as being part of that, and he did say that the MRA was going to be there. But what I can say, maybe this is adding some validity to the rumour, is that Colin Barnett did invite me to a function at Seaview Golf Club in 2 weeks' time.
Ladies and gentlemen, I did say we'd hope to finish by 9:30. I've got 5 more minutes of question time.
My name is... my name is Greg Ross, and I'm sorry I'm from way out of your region. In fact, I have a dreadful bloody confession to make. I live in the development of the Metropolitan Redevelopment Authority out in Midland, or now it's Woodbridge, we've been gentrified. And I think that leads to a topic that hasn't been touched on yet, with development that's happening everywhere. Tonight I left my apartment, no traffic jams in any way whatsoever, straight up the road, straight up Guildford Road, straight through the city, past that bloody abomination of Elizabeth Quay, down the road and across to here. It took me 1 hour. 1 hour to get from there to here. That's how long it took me, with no traffic jams, nothing. So we're talking about all sorts of redevelopments. Let's knock down this, let's ignore everybody here in the Western Suburbs and build the buildings that developers want, and we have no decent public transport system. I just spent a month in Europe. You can jump on a train and underground, and I'd like to know why in places like Germany, etc., where they have to go through rock, through granite, to build underground subways, and they build a new one every two weeks. We can't do it in sand. So that leads to the big problem of transport. And the more we crowd in on the Stirling Highway, you know how bad it is in the mornings just to get anywhere. It's only getting worse and worse. And that's one of the reasons that I'm actually standing as the independent candidate for Kalamunda. So again,
Have we got any more people standing as independent candidates?
My name's Pat Irwin. I'm also from Woodbridge, so I agree. I'm an architect. My question is ultimately to Max on the art codes, but can I just say, welcome, greetings from the eastern suburbs. These problems aren't just western suburbs problems, and my question to Max, I'll predicate by saying there's a slum development proposed at the end of my street, which is acceptable under the ADP provisions of the R codes, which means apparently that the objectives of the R codes are totally overruled, and the local authority, City of Swan, has no option other than to approve the ADP. At least that's how they explain it. They have to approve this slum development, which has got 4 or 5 blocks of 3 stories, 1.5 metres apart, crammed onto a site. I know you probably think I'm making this up, but it's actually true. And, we had a meeting with councillors there yesterday. I don't know if Greg knows about this one. But my question to you is, how on earth did we allow this to happen with the art codes, whereby the objectives have been totally overruled by these stupid ADP provisions? So our art codes have been absolutely inverted in their intention. And I think this has really got to be repealed immediately, I think.
Well, as I tried to explain in my paper, it's just a gradual erosion of local government's powers. The residential design codes are reviewed every few years, and every time they're reviewed, local government loses more and more control. When the residential design codes first came in, they were adopted statewide, but local government was allowed to have variations, provided they were clearly identified in their town planning schemes. They could change any element of them. Well, now that's impossible. There is no discretion in the R codes. It's all specified with these development criteria that you mentioned, and there's no local control anymore.
I'm going to take one more question. The gentleman over the back here.
My name is Brian Core. I'm a councillor in the City of Joondalup. Up there everything is fairly new, and when you come down here, first thing that struck me tonight coming in from the rear was the grounds and the buildings. And when you come into a hall like this, I think it's absolutely stunning. It struck me that if you have these council amalgamations, you're going to have fewer councils. So some of these civic areas will become surplus to requirements and will be sold off. And then, is it possible that in a few years after that, you'll be finding that instead of Mr. Seeger's little boxes, you could see standing here one of Mr. Barnett's 30-storey boxes, or a few of them. How does the panel feel that could happen?
In terms of the state government assuming land from the local council, you can only see the town of Cambridge some years ago, about 5 or 6 years ago, when the town of Cambridge lost the Ferry Lake site to the state Labor government at the time. So you're going to have a large-scale development right at Perry Lakes, and I don't know if anyone here's from Forest, but they probably know the impact that's going to have on the local traffic and the density and the noise within that precinct. And a lot of people were opposed to that development by Landcorp. Not only is the scale of the development so large, but it's also had an environmental impact and a lot of tree loss on that site. And we've had people who are passionate about saving trees, and I'm one of those, and there were people there who were told to move on because they were threatening Landcorp with this development. So, and not only that was the outcome, but you've also had a Bush Forever site on the AK Reserve that is now a sports stadium which has been totally decimated of cured trees, and it's now a sports stadium. So you've had the impact, you've seen a direct impact within our local area of the state government coming in and calling the shots, taking it from local government and doing precisely what it like. And you're going to have 6-storey buildings on the Underwood Avenue side of Perry Lakes development. So you've seen a classic example within our own sphere. So that can happen anywhere, on any zone land in any part of the Western Suburbs or metropolitan region. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've got a terrific audience tonight. Fantastic. Your hands must be bruised with all the tapping and feet going on. I would, on behalf of everyone, particularly the WSA, I'd like to thank the members who have spoken tonight and the panel, and taking part in the panel. They have been absolutely terrific, and make your, as they say in the classics, give it up for the speakers. By the committee to ask a couple of questions, and I will do that now, because if you would be prepared to show your hands as to whether or not you support what the committee is trying to find out, that would be very, very helpful indeed. And the first question is being written down, and I'll read it to you. How many of you feel that the government's centralisation of planning powers and disfranchisement of local government is unacceptable, that the DAPs should be terminated, and the right of appeal restored, and public open spaces should be preferred? Would you show your hands if you're in favour of that? I must say this comes as a huge shock. The second question is, and how many of you would support a statement of no confidence in the Planning Minister, John Day? Another shock. Thirdly, how many of you would say no local government reorganisation without majority community support? Show your hand. That finishes me. Colin, over to you.
Well, thank you all very, very much, and I think our thanks to due to Richard for being such a for being such a fabulous audience. What we've been hearing is reinforcing what the Western Suburbs has been saying, and I think also that our thanks have to be due to the 4 candidates who are here with us. They really deserve a round of applause. We knew that Wayne had thrown his hand in the ring because he made that public. We only got confirmation of Max and Kevin and Greg's intentions as this week has progressed. We said all along that the Western Suburbs Alliance wouldn't actually field any candidates, but of course candidates who publicly support our goals and principles will receive our support. It's not about party politics. It's about people asserting their democratic right to have their voices heard. We represent the majority of people. We are a grassroots movement. The Western Suburbs Alliance and people like Max, Kevin, Wayne and Greg are up against a well-funded party machine and professional spin doctors. We have no leaders forum to call upon with millionaire businessmen, property developers and some of the world's largest firms paying $25,000 a year to have exclusive access to Premier Barnett and his ministers. So the Western Suburbs Alliance will need your support, both financial and otherwise, and so will our candidates. There are actually forms on the seats, and if you'd like to suggest how you're willing to help us, that would be absolutely fantastic. We plan to hold some further forums in Subiaco and Edlands. It would be very remiss of me if I didn't thank very sincerely the other people on the WSA committee. That's Chris Wiggins, Ken Eastwood, Lynn Jennings, Linda Rogers, Pat Carmichael, who's somewhere one of the stars at the moment, I think. and the people who have already contributed very generously the funds, and either as members or more recently as donors. And I'd like also to thank the staff here and all of those who work behind the scene to make this event such a success tonight. Thank you very much for this event. I wrote down, go forth and multiply.